Hello, y'all. We are back with our content review for the AP exam. And just like in the last video, I would strongly recommend having the course and exam description, or the SED, up and available for you, either by Googling and pulling it up, by using one of the packets you got in class, or by using the key concepts that you have from old reading packets as well. So historical period 2, just like historical period 1, is one of the sort of like smaller percentages when you look at how the test breaks down. Same as historical period 1, you will not see this time period in the DBQ. You will not see this time period in SAQ 1, SAQ 2. You will see it potentially in the third SAQ, the one where you have choice of 3 and 4, and also in the first of the LEQ options, and of course in the multiple choice section. So just like I said for historical period 1, because you won't see it in any of the others, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about tends to, I think, feel to students kind of overrepresented in the multiple choice in particular. So some good stuff and some good content to know. Always important to know what the dates in the historical period stand for, key turning points. 1607, of course, is the founding of the first permanent or successful British colony in North America. That's Jamestown, in Jamestown, Virginia. And 1754 is the beginning of the fighting in what's going to be called the French and Indian War. And the reason that we're stopping there is that the French and Indian War is usually considered the beginning of the road to the Revolution period. So basically this unit is colonies, right, but before the road to the revolution. We're going to be doing a lot of comparing between different colonial regions in this time period in particular. So first up, thing number one that you need to know for this particular sort of historical era, you need to be able to basically compare the major colonial empires. So if you take a look at this map, you can see kind of like roughly where there was settlement in 1650, so pretty early. All of the green represents New Spain, which we talked about a little bit last historical period. We're going to talk some more about in just a second here. All of the orange represents New France. The British colonies are in blue. You can see them still split there. And then in between the British colonies in red, that is the Dutch colony, which is usually called New Netherlands. Okay, so comparing empires. This chart has all of the 4 major empires that you need to know a little bit of something about, kind of in order from top to bottom based on when they were founded. So starting at the top with New Spain, the sort of famous like mnemonic for New Spain's founding is that it was founded for God, gold, and glory. And if I had to pick one that I thought was most central, it's probably gold. Spain is definitely founded with an economic motive. The Spanish do wind up finding some gold, but the primary kind of like source of money for wealth for the Spanish Empire is going to be in mining silver, in particular in South America, and then also in just kind of general plantation agriculture, especially sugar cultivation in the West Indies, which is something that all of these empires have in common. There's a big fight over the sort of West Indies for sugar cultivation. The God part for the Spanish Empire is very heavily Catholic in the time period when New Spain is being founded, and so they're very, very interested in spreading Catholicism. All of the kind of like missions to conquer various places that New Spain winds up conquering and settling are all happen, like there's also priests along for the ride with all of those, and the priests are going to become, Catholic priests are going to become central to kind of like administering the Spanish colonies. One very kind of like specific thing that you need to be careful of in the past on questions that have dealt with this kind of topic or this time period, saying that empires like the Spanish wanted to spread Christianity has not actually been like counted as a point because it's not been seen as being specific enough. And so you do want to know that both the Spanish and the French, as you can see down one row, are very specifically Catholic. That really mattered to them, right? It was not Protestant Christianity. This is sort of in the midst of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. So that's sort of gold, and then God. And the last one, glory, sort of evokes a key thing about New Spain that really differentiates it from a couple of the other colonial empires on here, and that is that New Spain was very centralized. The Spanish sort of settlement project is funded by the Spanish crown, by the monarch, right, or by the state, essentially, of Spain, and most of the profits sort of flow back through the Spanish monarch and through Spain. That gives them quite a great degree of control sort of over the government in the colony. Again, very centralized is the word that we're going to use, and that is in contrast to some of the other empires that we'll talk about in just a second. For all of the empires, you need to know a little bit about their interactions with the native population that is sort of in the area that they are settling. The Spanish primary concern is getting labor out of Native Americans. They want to subjugate them, they want to convert them to Catholicism, and then they're looking to use them for labor, which is not ultimately very successful because for a variety of reasons. One is that indigenous people continue to die at a very high rate from disease, but also that because they're sort of living in their own community and areas where they know the land, they're much more able to kind of like escape essentially from native like forced labor. So this is where we see the importation of African labor that we talked a little bit about in the last unit. So that's New Spain. Next one down, New France. It shares some things in common with New Spain. They are both centralized, so the French monarch and the French government is also funding New France. It's, again, a sort of a state project. And the French are also Catholic and the French have a mixed religious population at home, but the colonizing arm of New France is Catholic, an interest in conversion to Catholicism. Big difference, though, is what the sort of economics of New France looks like. The New French economy is going to be almost entirely centered around broadly the fur trade, so trading in animal furs and animal skins, most specifically the fur and the skin of the beaver, which is an animal that's native to North America. It lives like partially in the water, so it has a waterproof, water repellent, I think, skin that was very popular, very sort of like trendy in this time period for making like hats and coats and things like that. So beaver fur, very, very valuable. And so the French, this impacts their relationship with Native Americans. They're less interested in like turning the Native American population into like agricultural labor and more interested in kind of like trading with them or setting up trading alliances or buying their furs or sort of using them to go into the interior and trap all of these beavers, skin them, bring their pelts back for sale. The major New French settlements are basically in like what is today Canada, so Quebec, right, Montreal, those types of areas right on the water and on the Great Lakes basically, and the French Empire, the New France Empire, is very sort of like water-based, lots of water-based travel. Next one down, the Dutch, a little bit of a blend of a bunch of the different other ones. This is our smallest empire, and it doesn't last for very long. Dutch Empire, located where New York is today, centered out of what is today New York City, what they called New Amsterdam. And this is the first, you can see down on the British as well, that's not founded by the Dutch government back at home, but that is instead founded by a company. This term joint stock company is a good vocab term for this unit and also kind of the previous one. Joint stock company is basically the very earliest version of a corporation. So something where you have a bunch of different people who are all kind of pooling their money. They're sort of buying stock essentially in this company, this concern, and then whatever profits come from the company, the colony in this case, go back to those shareholders in some equal split. So it's like where we're making money is the very sort of specific concern of these joint stock companies. And the Dutch are involved in trade. They're looking for a route to Asia. Now when that doesn't really like pan out, they wind up just sort of settling down and attempting to compete with the French in the beaver fur trade. So same deal there, and also basically the same relationship to Native Americans. The one key difference here is that the Dutch colony is not that interested in conversion. That's not something that they're quite as like interested in. Last, and I would say arguably most significant for this course, the way that it's structured, is the British. We're going to talk about the various regions of the British colonies, like coming up here in just a second, but sort of overall, the British colonies have a lot of things that are different than the others that we have talked about up here. Number one, the British colonies are not founded centralized. Some of them are founded like by the state or by the monarch, but what we're going to wind up with, famously, is sort of 13 very individual colonies founded with different reasons and for different causes. Some of them are founded by religious groups looking for religious freedom. Some of them are founded by joint stock companies. That's what Jamestown is, right? And their profit motive, just like the Dutch. Some of them are founded by the British Empire, by the monarch, whoever that is at the time, given as gifts or proprietary colonies. So a whole bunch of different things going on, and what that leads to is that the sort of governance of the British colonies is never as centralized as the government of New Spain or the government of New France are, and that's something that's going to come up more as we continue to go through these notes. Another really big major difference with the British is that the British, in comparison to all of the others up here, are the most interested in sort of settling and living on the land. Obviously, all of these are settler colonial projects, but the British in particular are bringing like whole families and sort of settling permanently in these areas. And their primary interest in the Native Americans is just getting them off the land in whatever sort of manner that may take. We're going to see signing treaties in some cases. We're going to see sort of making agreements in some cases. cases, but mostly we are going to see conflict, war, arguably genocide in some cases. We're looking to kind of push off Native Americans, kill them, just get them out of here, right, sell them into slavery, whatever the case is. For the most part, the British are not really very interested in converting Native Americans. There's some exceptions here. You might potentially remember learning about the praying towns that some Puritan communities founded to try to convert Native Americans, but that is not like widespread, and it's not a kind of characteristic of the British Empire overall. Last thing, if you take a look at the very last column on this chart, you'll notice the number of settlers, European settlers, that were inhabiting roughly each of these empires in the year 1700, just kind of as a general proxy for sort of the size. And you should really note, like, the big takeaway here is how much bigger the British Empire is in terms of like British settlers than any of the other empires. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we had like more people, because New Spain had a very large indigenous population from jump, and then a big imported enslaved population as well. But there are more like Europeans, right? And British in this case. That's going to play a very big role in the French and Indian War and how that plays out, and also in why the British are eventually going to become the dominant kind of colonial project in North America. So that's kind of the empires themselves compared. Again, very common subject for like an SAQ multiple choice set. Next up, we're going to check out the regions of the British colonies. Also, comparisons that you need to know or be aware of are comparisons within the British Empire, because the British colonies are where the United States sort of origin story comes from. We want you to know a little bit more in depth about sort of the various parts of the British colonies, and there is also a lot more variance within the British colonies than there is in either New Spain or New France, where, as I mentioned, things are quite a bit more centralized and under the control of the crown. So you need to know these four regions of the British colonies, and we could also add the West Indies in there. You'll hear me mentioning them a couple of times. And you also need to have a sense of which colonies fall in which regions. This is a very, very, very common mistake that students make, especially in LEQs and writing, but sometimes in sort of navigating the multiple choice questions as well. The College Board has recently started to sort of give you hints. They'll ask like, in the Chesapeake, parentheses, Virginia and Maryland, like what is the, social constructs or whatnot. So they have started to include that sometimes. I don't think you can count on it, number one, and number two, I still see students mess it up. So please try to make sure that for each of these colonial regions you have, I would say, like at least one sort of like central colony that you're like, okay, I know where this colony is. So this list that I have here, this goes from kind of like north to south. It's not an order of settlement, which is the way that we did them in class, but this is just sort of geographically from north to south. So at the top we have New England, that's in yellow on the map on the screen. Key central colony in New England is Massachusetts. Massachusetts starts out as two separate colonies, right? We have Plymouth, which is the first colony with the very first Pilgrims, the strict separatists, in 1620. And then 10 years later, we have Massachusetts Bay, which is also Puritans, but the sort of like less strict Puritans, the non-separatists, they're much better funded. And then those two colonies merge in, I believe, the 1680s, if I'm not mistaken, into the colony of Massachusetts. And that is like the central colony. Most of the other colonies in New England sort of spring out of Massachusetts. They kind of spawn from Massachusetts by people who don't like Massachusetts for some reason. They're rebelling against the Massachusetts Bay government, which was quite strict. So Connecticut is founded by Thomas Hooker, who is sort of like a rebellious Puritan minister and does not agree with a sort of Puritan orthodoxy, specifically about who should be able to vote. Rhode Island is founded by a guy named Roger Williams, who is also a sort of Puritan dissident, and then is also Anne Hutchinson as well is also associated with that colony. New Hampshire, I regret to inform you, is not important at all for the APUSH exam. I'm very sorry if you are from New Hampshire or have New Hampshire connections. You do not need to know anything about New Hampshire. Next one down, middle colonies. They're in kind of like the dusky red color there on the map themselves. Really two important colonies here. New York, which starts out as Dutch and then becomes British in the 1660s. And then Pennsylvania, which is one of those, we use the term proprietary colony, which means that it was sort of given as a gift to someone by the king. In this case, it was given as a gift by William Penn. So New York and Pennsylvania are your central colonies. New Jersey and Delaware, much less important. Don't really need to know anything about them specifically. Chesapeake, our main colony here, of course, is Virginia. This is where the sort of first and earliest colony is founded, and Virginia is going to remain really dominant colony throughout the kind of like colonial period, and then a dominant state in the early United States. Like, 3 of our first 4 presidents are from Virginia, and many others as well. Maryland, very much less important. The only thing you might potentially want to know about Maryland is that this is the one that's founded as like a Catholic haven. It's a proprietary colony that's given to a man named Lord Baltimore, where Baltimore, Maryland comes from, and he was a prominent Catholic. So that's the only sort of potential specific Maryland thing you might want to know. In the South, we start out with Carolina, right, as one colony, and then it splits into North Carolina and South Carolina after about 20 or 30 years. So we have those two, and that's sort of like the main colonies in the South. And then right at the end of the colonial period, only a couple of decades before the American Revolution, we have the colony of Georgia, which is founded as a buffer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So what the next few slides is going to do is we're going to kind of work through each of these, the sort of like rest of this chart. We're going to talk about New England colonies, then Middle colonies, then Chesapeake colonies, then Southern colonies, just to kind of remind you a little bit about what is going on with each and try to give you a few distinct terms that you can mention if you find yourself needing to talk about the government or the economy or the society in any of these colonies. So first up, New England. Sorry, again, we're going north to south here. First up, New England. So we already talked a little bit about who the colonies are and where some of those colonies come from. Economically, New England is primarily small farms. So what are often called yeoman farms, that word Y-E-O-M-A-N, which just means that they're sort of supporting a single family. And then the other thing that's going on in New England is that this is the term maritime economy. If you don't know the term maritime, that is a good one to know. It shows up a lot in sort of like questions and things like that in the College Board. Maritime just means having to do with the sea, right? Like marine. It's got that same M-A-R, mar root in there. So in New England, we're going to see a lot of whaling, hunting for whales, fishing, eventually shipping and shipbuilding are going to become very big. And we have what was for a very long time the biggest city in the colonies, which is Boston. That's the one that's founded as part of Massachusetts Bay. So New England, like a little bit of a mixed economy, but mostly based on small farming. Sort of regional touch points, things that you need to know about New England. Okay, so this is the colony that is founded by the Puritans. Again, a mixture of different types of Puritans, as I mentioned, but Puritan sort of like beliefs and culture are very dominant in the early decades. If you are talking about the 1600s, any thing that you're talking about and there's like the number 16 at the beginning of the year, then you can still effectively talk about the Puritan church. But it's good to remember that the Puritans get less influential the later that you go in the colonial period. And by the time we get to the 1700s, if the year has a 17 in front of it, you really shouldn't be talking about the Puritans anymore. They're kind of not a thing. We've turned into now the Congregational Church. In the early decades, when the Puritan hegemony or the Puritan sort of orthodoxy, which are both terms that mean sort of Puritan, like full dominance of all of government, all of society, and all of the economy are ongoing. A couple of things to know. Number one, from the Puritans, we get a speech, or a sermon, actually it was, it's usually called the City on a Hill sermon, that is often described as the first expression of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is something that we're going to see kind of going forward in a bunch of different historical periods. It's a reoccurring kind of thought in American history that basically is an argument that says that Americans are in some way sort of like special or different or like blessed. Americans are exceptional, right, in some way, shape, or form. And what the City on a Hill speech is arguing is that the Puritans are like sort of God's blessed and God's chosen people, and that they're destined to found this kind of society that will be like a beacon to the whole world. So again, if you see City on a Hill or American exceptionalism, this is sort of the original instance of that. I already talked a little bit about the dissenters on the last, there's names again if I was kind of going too fast on those. And then the other kind of big thing to know about the sort of colonial New England is that we have a little bit of a different sort of style of government here than we're going to see developing in some of the other colonial regions. It's much more local and much more direct democracy, and it stems from the Mayflower Compact, signed on board the Mayflower sort of like before they get there, which was basically just an agreement that like if there's a decision that needs to be made, all of the like adult men in the town will get together and they'll all have a vote on it. And so out of this in New England, we get a pattern of very small kind of like local town meetings or government meetings that are a very significant part of New England government. And that's where like a lot of decisions get made more at the local level, as opposed to the more sort of like colonial or eventually state level governments, entities that we're going to see in other colonies. If you take a look kind of right down beneath where my face is right here, you're looking at a couple graphics down there, and I want to highlight this one in particular. What this is a graphic of the town of Sudbury, Massachusetts, around 1635, so pretty early in the sort of New England period. And if you sort of zoom in on that, or if you potentially remember this from our notes in class, what you would see is a diagram that shows that New England towns are much more centralized, that you have sort of a central street and everybody's got their little house around it. There's a meeting meeting house where the church was. So you have sort of the church at the literal physical center of society. Then you have sort of farmland spread out around it. And this settlement pattern is something that the College Board has tested in the past. Again, we have these sort of like tight-knit villages where everyone is sort of like living close together in comparison to some of, especially like the plantation societies that we're going to see in the South. Last thing that's on here for New England is a mention of like native populations or native conflicts. This is one of those things where you might want to know just kind of like a native tribe for each of the regions. The Pequots are a good one in the New England area in particular. And there is a major, well, there's several major conflicts, but there's one particular major conflict that is called out in the College Board's curriculum. So you should sort of know a little bit about it. So I'm just going to click forward and we'll talk a little bit about that specifically. That is alternately called Metacom's War or King Philip's War. Metacom and King Philip are the two different names for the same person. This is a person who was the chief of the Pequot and who is the first Native American leader, at least of significance for us, to do something that we're going to see a bunch of other Native American leaders do, which is to try to get together like a coalition of Native American people from different tribes. So not just to like lead the Pequot, but to lead sort of like what we might call like a pan-Indian, right, or sort of like a coalition again of people from different tribes against the settlers, indicating sort of an acknowledgement or an understanding that there needs to be sort of a unified like Native versus like not Native, right, identity, which we don't always see from Native American conflicts early on. Other people that we're going to see like this later, for example, include Tecumseh. So we'll be kind of like picking up this thread. King Philip's War, Metacom's War, really brutal conflict between the settlers and Native Americans, lots and lots of death on both sides. It's an incredibly bloody conflict. Several impacts. Number one, King Philip and his followers are eventually defeated. King Philip is like beheaded. A lot of the Native Americans who fought in the war are sold off to be enslaved down in the West Indies or sort of pushed out of New England more permanently. So this is sort of the end of Native American conflict in New England, or at least any sort of large-scale Native American conflict. Also for the settlers, from the settler side of things, it provides like a little bit of a regional identity or sort of a unifying, because this is necessary, of course, because all of the New England colonies had grown by splitting off from Massachusetts. So that's New England. Next up, we have the middle colonies. So we're just, again, sort of like moving down here demographically. Again, New York and Pennsylvania are key colonies here, and both New York and Pennsylvania have urban cities, right, that are sort of at their, not at their geographical center, but at their sort of metaphorical center. New York has New York City, Pennsylvania has Philadelphia. And so what these colonies have is a mixed economy. They have urban areas where there is sort of trade and shipping happening. Both New York and Philadelphia have a very significant kind of like shipping industries. And then there's also a lot of land that's very good for sort of crop growing. In particular, the middle colonies are known for what are sometimes called breadbasket crops, which is the term that I've got on the slide here, and sometimes called cereal crops, like cereal, like you eat cereal. They're basically grain, right? Wheat, corn, rye, barley, those types of things are largely what's being grown in the middle colonies. A few other things that you might need to know about the middle colonies. Number one, it's good to remember that Pennsylvania is one of the colonies that's kind of like started with a mission, right? William Penn, who had the Pennsylvania Grant, was a reformer. He was very fond of the Quakers and then eventually converts to Quakerism later on in his life. And he basically wanted to see if a society sort of based on Quaker ideas could sort of survive. He called it the Holy Experiment. And so Pennsylvania has like a little bit of a different beginning than some of the other colonies. Another significant thing about the middle colonies that comes up sometimes is that these are by far the most diverse of the British colonies. And we say diverse here, mostly we mean sort of different types of white people from Europe. In particular, Pennsylvania had very liberal land policies. So we get a lot of German settlers. There's no New Germany, right? So if you're German and you want to settle somewhere, Pennsylvania is where a lot of them wind up. In New York, when the British take it over from the Dutch, they don't kick the Dutch out. They let most of them stay. So there are long trails of Dutch like history and identity there. Alexander Hamilton's wife, Eliza Schuyler, is a direct descendant of like one of the earliest New Netherlands settlers. Her father grew up speaking fluent Dutch. So did Martin Van Buren, who's like a president of the United States in the 1830s because he was from upstate New York. So again, long trail of like cultural residue in the middle colonies as opposed to others. Just clicking forward to emphasize that. This is a graphic that we saw in our notes in class. That's a good one to revisit. And if you want to, you can kind of pause here a little bit and look at what this talks about as far as the different ethnic and sort of linguistic diversity in sort of different parts of the colonies. So that's the middle colonies. Okay, so the Chesapeake. Chesapeake, again, is where our first colonization happens, and Virginia is our most central colony here, which starts out as the colony or the settlement of Jamestown and then grows into the Virginia colony. Virginia, unlike New England that we were just talking about, is not settled by families, but is instead settled largely by single men, right? If you remember in class, we talked a little bit about the whole younger sons thing, right? And Virginia, most significantly and most likely to come up in terms of founding motivations, is founded for economic motivations. This is one of the colonies that is founded as a joint stock company, so by a company that is looking to make money, and the colonists who go there, especially in the first kind of like generation of settlement, are primarily looking to make money, which they don't really do right away. The early years of the Virginia colony are very tough. Sometimes they're called the starving time. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's evidence of cannibalism. So things were rough in the early Virginia colony until tobacco is introduced. And tobacco is going to become kind of like the centerpiece of Virginia's economy and society. It's introduced pretty early. The colony's founded in 1607, and we see tobacco production in like the 1610s, basically. Chesapeake is a plantation-based society, so plantations are sort of large land grants, right, where you are generally usually growing multiple crops, but you have sort of one primary crop that you're growing to sell, which we call cash crop, right, agriculture. And tobacco, like some of the other crops that we're going to talk about, is quite labor-intensive. And so the colonists in the Chesapeake, as well as in other regions, are going to wind up relying very heavily on various enslaved or coercive labor systems. We start out with indentured servitude, which is sort of a temporary version of a coercive labor system. Indentured servants were generally British, right, from the British Isles, somewhere poor, people who had either been sold by their families or been sentenced by the court or sold themselves into indentured servitude for a period of 5 to 7 years. And while you were indentured, you were essentially owned by whoever owned your indenture, and you couldn't marry without their permission, and you were treated quite poorly. And indentured servitude, as we talked about in class, was quite profitable for landowners as long as the indentured servants are mostly not living out their indenture. So as long as the death rate is quite high, because at the end of the indenture, if you finish out your 5 years or 7 years, whatever it is, then you get a little bit of land, right? You get to go be free, and now you're just kind of like a poor white person in the colony. So what we're going to see in Virginia in particular is the shift or the development of labor systems away from indentured servitude and toward race-based chattel slavery. That's one of the sort of stories in Virginia in the 1600s. And in particular, we're going to see this around Bacon's Rebellion, which we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail a couple of slides on. Other things that you should know about the Chesapeake, this is where we see our first kind of like governing institutions that are representative democracy, so not direct democracy like we saw in New England with the Mayflower Compact and the town meetings, but representative democracy where you are electing someone to sort of represent you right in the government, and specifically the House of Burgesses, which begins in 1619, the same year that the first enslaved Africans arrive in Virginia colony. The Chesapeake is also a great place to talk a little bit about charters, right? Again, this colony starts as a charter colony, a colony that is a company, right, essentially. But like every other colony in the British Empire, it is eventually going to become a royal colony, at least in theory, under the direct governance of the king by the time that we hit the 1700s. Primary group of Native Americans in the Virginia area, at least early on, are the Powhatan. So there's several wars with the Powhatan that are good to talk about or to take a look at if you're looking for examples of Native conflict. So that's the Chesapeake in brief. Last region, the South. So the Chesapeake is what we think of as part of the South today. Like I think we would generally class Virginia as the South, but sort of the South, right, or the Deep South, the Southern colonies, consist of the Carolinas and then eventually Georgia. We start out with Carolina, the North and South Carolina split, as we mentioned earlier. These are also going to be plantation, right, cash crop type societies with a lot in common with what we just talked about in the Chesapeake, but different crops, specifically rice. rice, indigo, and then also a little bit of sugar as well on the South Carolina coast are going to be the primary crops here. Biggest mistake that I see students make when talking about sort of like cash crop agriculture is pushing cotton too early. Remember that cotton does not become a major cash crop in the United States or really elsewhere until the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the patenting in 1794. So basically a good way to think about it is like no cotton until after the Revolution. So we did actually grow some cotton, but just not a ton. It was a very labor intensive. Biggest differentiator between the Chesapeake and then the southern colonies, the Carolinas, is the connection to the West Indies. The Carolinas are largely founded by planters who did not immigrate directly from Great Britain, but instead came from British islands in the West Indies where they were sugar planters, or in some cases failed sugar planters. And the vision for the Carolinas, and that's really exemplified in the city of Charleston, is for this to be sort of like a stopover or like a part of the sugar trade that is in sort of intensifying in the Caribbean and that is quite valuable. And so the Sugar Islands, West Indies, already had sort of an established system of slavery. And when the Carolinas are settled in the 1680s, the planters sort of bring that system with them. So in Virginia, we see slavery sort of develop, right, as these slave codes sort of build and as indentured servitude is sort of squeezed out. But in the Carolinas, they're sort of there from jump. And South Carolina, at the time of the Revolution, is going to be majority enslaved. Like if you look at the population of South Carolina in the 1770s, over 50% of the people who live in the colony are enslaved laborers. South Carolina is also the most valuable colony in the sense of producing the most for Great Britain. And so that is one reason why it's a concern to the British Empire, basically, that South Carolina is vulnerable because it is the closest to Spanish Florida. So if you look at that little map on the slide, you can see Florida kind of down below there. Florida was a Spanish colony. Spain and Great Britain are fighting throughout this time period. And Spain also, as a way of kind of poking at the British colonies, had declared slavery illegal in Spanish Florida specifically, not in their other colonies, but in Spanish Florida. And so what we see is enslaved people in South Carolina trying to flee and run to Spanish Florida where they think that the Spanish might protect them. The most famous example of this is what's usually called the Stono Rebellion. That is probably the only specific slave rebellion that you need to know before the Revolution, and against an uprising of 20 or 30 enslaved Africans, most of whom are directly from Africa, which is relatively unusual in the British colonies, who are running for freedom. They're caught. Many of them are killed or re-enslaved. But this sort of convinces a lot of people in Great Britain that South Carolina needs to be kind of protected from Spanish Florida, which is doing raids and things like that in addition. And so this is where we get the impetus for Georgia, the very last founded colony. It's founded as a buffer colony, and it's also a proprietary colony, like we talked about with Pennsylvania. It's given as a gift to a guy named James Oglethorpe, and Oglethorpe has sort of reformer visions of of Georgia as being a colony where Britain can send their debtor prisoners, people who are in prison for being in debt. So it has sort of a vision of social reform, although very quickly just sort of becomes like South Carolina Part 2. It's worth also noting here that the southern colonies are going to generally be the most loyalist. When we get to the American Revolution, next historical period, this is where we're going to see a big concentration of loyalists, and Georgia in particular is the colony that is the least likely to be participating in the sort of road to the revolution stuff. If you remember, they don't even go to the First Continental Congress, among others. So that's sort of the colonies as a whole. Here is one more kind of quick shot here of the sort of full chart, and if you want to kind of pause this here or flip back, obviously you can get them. There is a strong likelihood that you will get some sort of question that will involve comparing the colonial regions in some way, shape, or form. Not a certainty, but a strong likelihood. In addition to comparing the colonial regions, there's some things that we do need to know that are sort of common to all of them. I have a few of them on here. So all of the colonies share the same sort of labor system progression. So it happens at slightly different times in them, but they all do have indentured servitude. So that's not a thing that's only limited to Virginia. Indentured servants are present in all of the colonies in the early years and decades. And then all of the colonies eventually are going to transition to race-based chattel slavery, which we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail on a slide or two down here. And by some of the colonies, a couple of the colonies try to start out without slavery. So Georgia, for example, outlaws it originally, and so does, I believe, Pennsylvania. But by the time of the Revolution, slavery is legal in every single one of the colonies. We tend to think of it as being associated with the South, as it, I think, increasingly is, but it was very present in the northern colonies as well. Typical governing structure of the colonies, this has come up on occasion. All of the colonies are going to eventually have a royal governor appointed by the kings when they become royal charters. And then most of those governors are going to appoint their own governors, councils, wealthy colonists, wealthy planters for the most part. And then all of the colonies are going to have some version of a colonial assembly. This is a legislature, right, that is making laws. Virginia's is called the House of Burgesses. Many of the other states call theirs like the House of Delegates or something of that nature. They represent the privileged class. Remember that the only people who can vote in the colonies are white and male and 21 or older. And in most colonies, with the exception maybe of Rhode Island, you had to have some level of wealth. You had to be like a landowner in some colonies or a taxpayer in other colonies. So sort of a restricted class, right, of voters. And then, of course, in New England, as we talked about, we have those town meetings. Other things that all of the colonies have in common that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of slides here is they're all influenced by what the College Board will often refer to as transatlantic exchanges. That's a good phrase to be familiar with, and it just means that the colonies are influenced by things coming to them from largely Europe. So things that are being exchanged across the Atlantic Ocean, ideas in particular, and there's two really good examples of things that come, ideas, movements that come across the Atlantic Ocean. One is the Enlightenment and the other is the First Great Awakening, which we're kind of getting into here. Other examples of transatlantic exchanges, the College Board will talk about the fact that the colonies become anglicized, which means that they are sort of English-style governments and English-style societies, no matter how they started out. So even a colony like New York that started out Dutch is anglicized by the time of the Revolution. And that happens through this transatlantic intellectual and print exchanges. We're getting newspapers and media and things like that coming to us from Great Britain that greatly influence our society and kick off things like the Revolution here as well. The other major transatlantic exchange that is going on is the Atlantic slave trade, and we're going to spend some time talking about that here as well. This obviously does not just involve England or does not just involve Europe, but of course involves in particular the west coast of Africa as well. So you can see that map up there. That's what's usually known as the triangular trade, right? That involves trade going from Europe to Africa, picking up enslaved Africans, enslaved labor as cargo, and bringing them to somewhere in the Americas, often in South America or the Caribbean, sometimes directly up to North America. If you look at that sort of graph on the bottom of this slide, what that's showing is sort of like the volume of the slave trade in the time that it exists. The slave trade is like basically dates to the beginning of this class. It starts when European exploration starts. The first Portuguese slave traders are in the 1490s, right? Just like Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And if you look at this sort of, again, like upwards escalating, the kind of like height of the transatlantic slave trade, like when are the most people being kidnapped and enslaved and taken to the New World, is basically in the 1700s. So in this kind of like century around the American Revolution, that's when we see this sort of slave trade at its height. And one of the biggest things that the College Board will ask you to know if you get a question about slavery is basically how does slavery sort of change over time, the institution of slavery and sort of the experience of slavery. So this is a big CCOT, continuity and change over time topic, because slavery exists for a very long time in the Americas, so you can sort of trace how it grows and changes. Continuities are things that stay the same. Changes are things that change. And so you should be trying to keep track of a couple of examples of things that stay the same within the institution of slavery, and then sort of points where things change as well. So we're going to see that evolve if you continue to watch these videos over a series of slides that look like this. So here we have sort of the 1500s and the 1600s, or the 16th and 17th century, as far as some sort of major things to know about the institution of slavery in the Americas. Again, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in the 1500s, and the fact that in the 1500s and continuing in the 1600s, we still very much have like a blending of different sort of backgrounds of enslaved people. Many people who are still coming, who are directly from Africa, were born somewhere in Africa, speak an African language, grew up in that culture and that community, and are now enslaved in the Americas somewhere. And also, increasingly, as we get into the 1600s, we have people who are enslaved who are more what we might term African American, right? They were born here. They've spoken, in our case, English, right, since they were born. They don't have direct experience of that African, culture. They have what's been passed on to them, right, but not their own experiences. And so the kind of unique African American or Black culture that's created in the United States comes from these blendings, right, of these sort of generations. And it's going to be significant when we stop seeing that new influx of like people with direct African heritage or direct African experience coming in, and we start to see a more concentrated like African American population. We'll get to that, I think, more in the 1700s and 1800s. Other things that are on here that I want to highlight, I've already mentioned this idea that race-based chattel slavery is something that develops right in the colonies, in particular in the 1600s in Virginia is like a really great place to kind of trace that. Usually it is developed through the kind of like passing of laws that are called slave codes. The earlier that you go in slavery, the more sort of like loose the boundaries are of who is enslaved and of like, can you get out of being enslaved? Those types of things are a little bit more up in the air and a little bit more situational early on. And then the later that you go in slavery, the more harsh and more strict the slave codes get. And we start to get things that say that your situation, whether you're enslaved or free, descends directly from the mother. And we start to get things that say, well, okay, you cannot sue for your freedom just because you've converted to Christianity, which is something that we saw some people try to do in the early years. The turning point in kind of like when do we go from like most laborers being indentured servants to most laborers in the Chesapeake in particular being enslaved, race-based chattel slavery, is usually sort of historians point to Bacon's Rebellion, which is actually a rebellion that doesn't have anything to do with slavery. This is not a slave rebellion itself, but it does prove to be kind of a turning point. So we are going to kind of click and talk about that just a little bit. Bacon's Rebellion is in 1676. This is a very useful date to remember, and it's kind of easy if you can just remember it's 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence, 1776, Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. It's in Virginia. Don't get it confused with other big rebellions or anything like that, right? King Philip's War or anything of that nature. And this is basically a class rebellion. We see these a lot in American history. Poor people sort of rising up against what they see as sort of the oppression of the wealthy. In this case, in particular, Bacon's Rebellion is a rebellion that consists mostly of former indentured servants, some white, some black, some enslaved people, just sort of poor white people in general who are living in kind of like the back country area of Virginia and who are upset at the governor of Virginia because they believe that the governor is sort of not taking care of them and not protecting them from Native Americans. The governor, a guy named Berkeley, has made like a treaty for trade with like the local Native Americans. And so Bacon's Rebellion is headed by the guy in the slide, Nathaniel Bacon. They're sort of storming in towards Jamestown, this sort of like central town in the colony at the time, killing any Native Americans that they come across, burning all sorts of things. They get to Jamestown. Nathaniel Bacon dies of, I think, cholera, if I'm not mistaken, but a disease anyway. The rebellion sort of collapses, but it really scares the sort of wealthy planter class of Virginia, who are kind of looking around and realizing that they're sort of outnumbered by like former indentured servants, enslaved people, right, by the kind of like the laboring class. These are people who don't have very many rights and don't have very many opportunities. They can't vote, right, as we've talked about. And so what we see, whether consciously or not, on the part of the planter class after 1676 is many of Virginia planters starting to make the decision not to go with indentured servants who someday will be free of your control and might rise up against you and try to kill you, but instead to go with enslaved Africans or descendants of enslaved descendants of Africans who are much more easily identifiable, who serve for life increasingly, and are therefore much more sort of, firmly under control or feel more firmly under control. So again, Bacon's Rebellion is not a slave rebellion, but it is a rebellion that leads to changes in the institution of slavery, and it's a pretty key term to remember for this historical period. Moving on, other kind of things that impact all of the colonies in some specific way, the Enlightenment. Hopefully we're familiar with the Enlightenment. It's a big one for this class. So an intellectual movement. It starts in Europe broadly and heavily in Great Britain, and then sort of comes across the Atlantic to the colonies. So again, it's a really great example of something that's spread by that transatlantic print culture, transatlantic exchanges. And the Enlightenment emphasizes basically that like things around the world are not just sort of there because they're there, but they can be explained. Like you can explore like, gravity, or like, why does like, the sun do this, or why does sort of the natural world happen this way? And also the Enlightenment involves exploring sort of like why are societies organized the way that they are? Why do we have the governments that we do? Like why are kings question mark, why are kings? And so the Enlightenment is going to produce a lot of new ideas about government, what government is, what government could be, things like the social contract, right, that come from John Locke in this time period, and natural rights are good examples of Enlightenment thought that's going to wind up having big influence in the colonies themselves. Many of I would say, of our founding fathers are very heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. Many of them are deists, right, which is the sort of more distant idea of God the clockmaker or God the watchmaker. Ben Franklin is if you're looking to somebody who's an Enlightenment dude in the Americas, Ben Franklin is probably your best example. At the same time, there is what is potentially viewed as a little bit of a backlash to the Enlightenment, or at least comes in the midst of the Enlightenment, and this is the First Great Awakening. We have two really big Great Awakenings that you need to know in this class. This is the first one. There's a second one roughly 100 years later. This is in the 1740s, so we're about 30 years or so before the Revolution at this point. This also comes over, this time most directly from Great Britain, primarily by a minister named George. You'll see Whitfield with no E in the middle sometimes, or Whitefield with the E in the middle. He seems to have spelled it both ways. That's him in the painting right there, looking kind of zombie-esque. And what George Whitefield is a minister who is basically trying to kind of revive the sort of emotional spirit of Britons and then eventually colonial Americans to feel sort of more connected to a personal experience of the Christian religion. Both of the two Great Awakenings are revivals in the sense that they're intending to kind of bring back religion and religious feeling. They're going to cause divisions within existing congregations, the Presbyterians kind of divide into pro and anti-revival, so do the Congregational churches, and they're also going to bring us the beginnings of some new denominations that weren't really very present before this. In particular, the Methodist and Baptist churches are really sort of introduced in this time period. They're spread by itinerant ministers, is the phrase the College Board uses. Itinerant means wandering, so you don't have one home church where you preach every Sunday. You're sort of going from place to place and giving kind of guest sermons. Both of the two Great Awakenings are going to have a big impact on women, and particularly increased church membership among women. They tend to promote religious pluralism. The divide of old lights, new lights. Old lights is anti-revival, new lights is pro-revival, is significant when we get to the Revolution. We're going to tend to see the sort of new light churches and congregations being much more supported, much more patriot, right, much more supportive of the Revolution. The First Great Awakening rhetoric, the sort of emotion that it tends to attempt to inspire is fear, basically. This is much more Old Testament, if that is something that means something to you. Jonathan Edwards, the other minister name that I have on here, his most famous sermon is a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this is the one where it's man is destined to hell as sparks fly upward, and God is holding you like a loathsome spider over a pit of burning flame. So very leaning into the sort of scary, right, threat of hell parts of religion to sort of inspire religious devotion. I'm mentioning that here because that's in contrast to the Second Great Awakening, which tends to lead more into the perfection of mankind, New Testament type stuff. So both this Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening are good examples of kind of cultural things that are happening in all of the colonies, not just in one specific region. Last kind of topic for this particular historical period has to do with the relationship between Britain and the colonies. So what is the relationship between Britain and the colonies, and the extent to which the British Crown is controlling the colonies? And in particular, I think it's good to keep in mind something that we talked about in the last video, which is that other sort of colonial empires, New Spain in particular, are very centralized and are under the direct control of the monarch, pretty much throughout their existence. The British colonies have never been centralized, right? They were founded as a set of separate colonies with different founders and different goals. And the British Crown, at various points in time, sort of throughout its history, is going to sometimes attempt to take more control over the colonies, they really kind of want what Spain has, right, in some cases. And it's generally not going to work. So some big terms on this slide. One of the sort of main goals of all of the colonial empires in this time period, but certainly the British, is what's usually referred to as mercantilism, or mercantilism if you prefer. This is the basic economic theory that governed most of sort of how countries in Europe operated in this time period, which essentially said that the way to achieve dominance among your kind of your peer countries, is to sort of have more stuff that you can sell them than they have that you need, right? So more a favorable balance of trade is what this is called. And the best way to achieve that, theorizes mercantilism, is to get colonies. You get colonies, you can take all of their raw goods, you can sell them stuff, right? So they're sort of like a captive audience. And the colonies solely exist to be like an economic benefit to the mother country. And in Britain, what that leads to, in the British Empire, what that leads to is a sense among, not all, but some British monarchs that like, it's like fine if the colonies are kind of governing themselves or if they're like a little bit more autonomous, as long as they're still doing the mercantilism thing, as long as they're still bringing in money for the British Empire, there's sort of a net gain, and like it's not that big of a deal, right, if they're passing their own laws, say, for example. This is an attitude that we call salutary neglect, right? Neglect that is good for you, or neglect as long as it is good, right, is maybe another way to interpret that. And for a big chunk of the early colonial period, this is kind of unstated, right? It's not like the king sits down and is like, I know, I'm coming up with salutary neglect. It's just sort of like the way that the British colonies develop, that they're not exerting too much direct control. But starting from the 1690s onward, there's going to be a little bit more of an attempt by the British crown, various British crowns, to form like a more coherent policy to control the colonies. And the biggest example of that is the Navigation Acts. If you get a question about the relationship of Britain and the colonies that includes this time period, the Navigation Acts is a great piece of specific information to talk about. The British pass a series of them. They try a whole bunch of different versions starting in the 1650s. So you don't need to know any specific one, just the Navigation Acts is fine. It's good to have a sense of sort of when they are passed or when they start to be passed. But mostly what the Navigation Acts do broadly is they try to restrict trade with the colonies to only trade, like the colonies are only supposed to be trading with British ships, or with the British themselves directly. So instead of like the colony of Virginia trading with like Haiti, which is a French colony, Saint-Domingue, for like, rum, right, or sugar, say, that sugar would go from Saint-Domingue to England and then from England to Virginia instead of just going directly from Virginia to, or excuse me, from the French colony to Virginia itself. So the Navigation Acts are kind of a pain if you are a colonist. They make things more expensive because it's got to go on like a much longer journey. You've got to pay additional taxes. And so the colonists develop a proud tradition of smuggling, which is basically bringing goods into the country, or the colony in this case, without paying taxes on them in avoidance of the Navigation Acts. This was widespread in basically every colony, and most colonists did not really think that this was wrong or didn't have too much of a problem with it necessarily. A good thing to like be aware of that will set you apart from other students taking the AP exam is to be aware that even before the French and Indian War, there are examples of colonial resistance to British policies. It's not some scenario where we were like perfectly happy and loyal, and then came like the French and Indian War and the taxes, and we sort of turned on the British. In fact, there's several examples, many more than are on this slide, but certainly a few on this slide, of colonists resisting British attempts to sort of bring them more under control. You can view Bacon's rebellion that way, that we just talked about, because it is a rebellion against the British appointed governor and his policies, right? So that's certainly an example there. Probably the best example is what's called the Dominion of New England, the King of England in the 1680s. This is Charles James, this is the James at the end, so James II, is basically wants to have sort of like more of a New Spain vibe. So he revokes all of the charters of all of the New England colonies and also New York, and just tries to make them into one big sort of centralized colony called the Dominion of New England. The colonists hate this. The colony of Connecticut famously, supposedly, hides its colonial charter in a tree rather than give it up. They hate the governor, and in about a year and a half, when James is overthrown in the Glorious Revolution back in Britain, the colonists will sort of happily overthrow his governor, a guy named Edmund Andros, and immediately return to their sort of like original charter situation. Smuggling is another great example of resistance to British policies, right? It's a way of avoiding the Navigation Acts. And just in general, and this sort of last thing down here at the bottom is, this comes directly from a key concept. So the colonies are developing into what we call autonomous institutions. Autonomous means like self-governing, right? They are basically operating without any intervention from the British themselves. They're anglicized. They look British. They use British common law, right? They have very similar court systems, but they're not like exact copies. They're not dependent. Some good evidence of this is the trial of John Peter Zenger, who's a newspaper editor who was being tried for libel for saying very mean things about the governor of New York. And the courts in New York, in the colony of New York, basically decide that it's not libel or it's not punishable if it's true, which is not a decision that had any precedent in British common law. So Zenger's trial is sometimes cited as an early example of the freedom of the press, but more directly an early example of how American institutions, even though they look British, are operating autonomously. So this takes us up to the end of historical period 2, which, remember, ends right as the French and Indian War starts in 1754. The French and Indian War is the start of the road to the revolution, and that is where we will pick up in the next video. Thank you all for your time. Bye.